Hey everybody. So we are now getting into a topic that I think is really important to understand today. Um, a lot of people have questions about things like terrorism and Islamic Jihad and like where these come from, why they happen, and what's motivating the people who do them. Um, and I'm gonna make a case that may be a bit different from what you'd hear in the mainstream news. Um, yeah, as you see, I titled this slideshow and now video, Islam, the Great Deceit. And so you'll see where that comes from in a little while. Yeah, this is an issue that is of particular interest to me. I think it's really important to understand, and I think very few people do understand it. And it is a major demographic movement that we see that Islam is the world's second largest religion, and most think that within, I don't know, a century, it will be the largest religion in the world, mostly because of high birth rates among Muslims. That said, we really should try to understand the origin of Islam and then how it interacts with the world today and what we can expect from it. Okay, so first up, I have a quote here that's from George W. Bush. He was president before Obama. And this is a quote of his that said, "The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. These terrorists don't represent peace. They represent evil and war." So this is a pretty standard type of statement that you hear from politicians because, of course, they don't want to look like they're at war with, quote, Islam, which would represent 1.5 billion people roughly. When violence emerges, it's much easier just to say, well, these are just a fringe minority group of people who misunderstand their religion and this is why they do these things. Or maybe they're not even doing them because of religion. Maybe they just are greedy or selfish or whatever. And so the question is, well, why do they do these things? So we'll get into it. Okay, so to start with, we're going to go back and look at Islam's history, from the early origins. And the truth of it is, the history of Muhammad, who is the founder of Islam, is really pretty uncertain. The earliest biography of him is from a guy named Ibn Ashaq, and actually, even Ibn Ashaq didn't even write it down. He kind of said what the information was, and then a sort of student of his named Ibn Hisham took what Ibn Ashaq said and crafted a biography of Muhammad. It's written about 200 years after Muhammad was born, and it's called The Life of Muhammad. So you compare that to, say, the Gospel texts or a lot of the New Testament, which are written within a generation of Jesus being on earth, right? Uh, People argue about how long after, but even people who think it was or on the later end of things still say by around 80, 100, or 110. Really, when you study it, I think it's more fair to conclude that a lot of the gospel or the gospels in the New Testament were written within, say, 30 to 40 years of when Jesus was resurrected. This is a big difference, right? 30 to 40 years. In that span of time, you have people alive who had been alive while Jesus was alive. 200 years, no one is still alive from when Muhammad was alive, right? That said, there is a fairly accepted narrative about Muhammad's life, and particularly among Muslims. Um, and this is kind of how it goes. So the general perception is that he was born in AD 570. He was orphaned at age 6 and then raised by his grandfather and uncle. He didn't receive very much schooling. In fact, he was illiterate. And because he was illiterate, Muslims view the Quran as a miracle. When I say must have been there, that's their interpretation. They say that, hey, if he was illiterate, how could he produce this book unless it was given to him by divine power? And so, in fact, Muhammad offered the Quran as the only miracle validating his prophethood, meaning he needed to show some reason for people to believe that he was a prophet. And what he offers is, he said, "Well, I give you this Quran because clearly the beauty and wisdom found in this text can only be divine, and it validates my statement that I am a prophet." So, at age 25, Muhammad married a woman named Khadija, who was a businesswoman, and she was about 40, so older than Muhammad. Now, keep in mind, all this that I'm saying right now is the quote standard narrative about Muhammad's life. Um, as the more you investigate these things, the more questionable a lot of this is. But Muhammad then, as he's a young adult in his mid 20s, starts hearing voices while meditating, and he's not sure about the source of them. In fact, he initially thought that he was hearing demonic voices, which is kind of strange, obviously, because normally a prophet isn't going to mistake the voice of God for the voice of a demon. But that's what he first thought. In fact, he even like would run up a mountainside or a building and think, "Oh, I'm just going to fling myself off it. I want to be free from these voices." And then supposedly an angel stopped him to say, "No, no, no, don't do that." Um, but ultimately, his family convinced him that these were divine revelations, that they actually came from God. Okay, so then as we go forward, Muhammad, as he's become convinced that he's receiving revelation from God, he wants to spread this message of Islam. Islam meaning submission to the will of Allah. So that's the meaning of Islam. It does not mean literally peace, it means submission to the will of Allah. And his kind of target group for this is the polytheists of Mecca. So people who believe in multiple gods and they live in Mecca, the city he lived in. Well, Meccans, so people from Mecca, rejected the message that Muhammad brought, and they became frustrated with him and they drove him and his followers out. And in actuality, what we find is that Muhammad had ridiculed their gods, and so when he was just kind of sharing his beliefs, they weren't real bothered. But as he ridiculed their gods, they were really bothered by that, and so they drove him out of Mecca. And what does he do? Well, he's been driven out of Mecca. He flees to Medina, and this is what people normally call the Hijra, the movement from Mecca to Medina. So in Medina, Muhammad is seen as a person who can act as an intermediary in disputes between monotheistic Jews and polytheistic Arabs. So the idea here is, well, Muhammad is Arab, but he's monotheist. So he's kind of this middle ground figure between Jews who are monotheistic and Arabs who are polytheistic. It's like he's kind of got a piece of each of those by being a monotheistic Arab. Um, and he also starts growing his power by leading raids on caravans from Mecca. So they are these caravans, they're trading caravans, and he starts building a following, sending out groups to go and raid and attack them. Obviously, you can already see this is a religious figure that looks a bit different from what we might find in someone like Jesus, right? He's doing things that are a bit different. And then finally, with 10,000 followers, he leads an attack on Mecca, subdues it, and sorry, this got cut off at the bottom, but he destroys. There are idols around this building called the Kaaba. And the Kaaba he left standing. The Kaaba is this big black cube, and this remains the pilgrimage site for Muslims today. So this is what's interesting. It's a polytheistic holy site, um, but he leaves it intact, and not only does he leave it intact, it now becomes the site of worship for Muslims. So when they pray toward Mecca, they're praying toward this building that had previously been one that was used by polytheists. Kind of strange, but that is what he did. Okay, so now we're going to move away from Muhammad's life into looking at his religion, the actual things that he was teaching. And you may recall when the Greens were here last year, they led us through a week where we looked at the different pillars of Islam called the five pillars. So I'll have you guys look at those on your own, which is page 267. They're really important for understanding Islam and the core beliefs about from an average Muslim. You also have a mosque. A mosque is an Islamic house of worship. so sort of equivalent to a church or a synagogue, although the way that Islamic worship happens is fairly different from Christian worship. It's much more about a routine of going and praying in a very specific way. But in any case, this takes place in a mosque. Okay. Uh, the other very foundational thing of Islam is the Quran. Quran means recitation. Now, this is interesting because the Quran we think of as a book, but it means recitation. Recitation is something done orally, like spoken. And so the teaching in Islam is that the Quran was transmitted orally from the angel Gabriel. So they believe that Allah cannot interact directly with the world, that he is too sort of transcendent, too far above creation to interact with it directly. So instead he does so through an intermediary which is Gabriel, the angel Gabriel. Yeah, which obviously you may notice Gabriel is a figure in Christianity and Judaism, because Islam conceived of itself as sort of a fulfillment of those earlier belief systems, and so we'll see more about that later. Um, this idea that Allah can't interact directly with His creation is problematic because Muslims say that they believe in Christian and Hebrew texts, and Muhammad himself affirmed these earlier texts. Now, Muslims today generally will say that, no, well, we would, but those texts have been corrupted over time. However, Muhammad himself didn't say that. Muhammad affirmed these earlier texts and said that you should, respect them and reference them and use them to guide you in your life. And for example, in Genesis, Moses encounters God himself speaking to him from the burning bush. And obviously, that's God interacting very directly with creation. And so this is a problem for Islamic doctrine. Muslims also believe that only the Arabic version is the true word of Allah. So you can have translations of the text, that's fine, you can read them. But, if you have issues with what you're reading, a lot of time a Muslim will just say, well, you need to read it in the Arabic to truly understand it, because only the Arabic is the real speech of Allah. Okay, accompanying the Quran, you have other texts called the Hadith. Now, like it says there, the Hadith are a collection of traditions containing sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which, with accounts of his daily practice, the Sunnah, constitute the major source of guidance for Muslims apart from the Quran. The Hadith is really tremendously important for Muslims because even though they would say the Quran is the most important book handed down from God, there's very little in the Quran about Muhammad himself and like what he did. So if you, but one thing the Quran says is that Muhammad is the pattern of conduct for Muslim believers. Well, if he's the pattern of conduct, you kind of need to know what he did and how he lived. So that's when you turn to these other texts, like the Hadith, and they then say, well, Muhammad did this and he said this. And so now we can say, okay, well, we'll use that to know what we're supposed to do in our lives. The thing is, the Hadith, uh, different Muslim groups will argue a lot about which Hadith are like the ones that you should really go by and which ones are less reliable. The very reliable ones they will say are Sahih, meaning like very reliable. But if you can, really conclude which are the most reliable Hadith, then you're supposed to use it alongside the Quran. Okay, and then you have a third important word here, the Sunnah. The Sunnah is Muhammad's example, the best way of living. And that means Muhammad is the model of conduct, like I said, for all Muslims. And so you'll find out in our live class really what that means. Okay, and the reason I say that is, well, what this obviously means it's really important what Muhammad was actually like if you're going to say he is your pattern of conduct. Well, we already saw he raided these caravans, right? So the big question is, what else did he do if he's going to be the model of conduct for Muslims through the centuries? You're going to have to wait to find that out. That said, I refer to Islam as the Great Deceit because, in addition to billions of Muslims through the centuries, it has duped countless Westerners into thinking that Islam is peaceful and that the best way to protect all people is to shield Muslims from criticism, from Islamophobia. I'm going to leave you with this. This is just a teaser of what it really does look like when we look at Islamic violence. If you look at that image, on the bottom are the Crusades, criticized a lot. The top, Muslim conquest battles.